Report 1. My name is Helena, and I live in a small town in Oregon, where the dense forests and constant fog already set the stage for what I do. I'm a mortician, a profession I chose not by chance, but through a mysterious calling I've always felt, a fascination with the thin veil that separates the living from the ethereal. My journey began during my youth when a series of unexplainable events surrounding the death of my grandmother left me with more questions than answers. This curiosity transformed into a life purpose, and I found in mortuary science a way to be close to this threshold, trying to understand the mysteries it conceals. I work at a mortuary clinic that, for many, sends shivers down their spine just by approaching the entrance. Located at the edge of a dimly lit road, the old building, with its windows always covered by heavy curtains, seems to hold dark secrets. The wind always seems to whisper among the trees around, as if it were telling stories of those who have passed here. Before we continue with more revelations about horror stories, I would like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and click like if you are enjoying the content. Your interaction is crucial for us to continue unveiling mysteries that challenge our reality. Don't forget to comment below from which city you are watching, to know how far our stories are reaching. My first truly chilling experience occurred on an unforgettably dark night. There was a client waiting for us, as a colleague joked when he saw me arrive. But as I walked down the dark corridor, crossing paths with two police officers leaving the place, a chill ran down my spine. They were bringing in the body of a man with multiple perforations, a victim of brutal violence. As I started the procedure, my colleague Leo, name I use here for his privacy, whispered with a disturbed look, "Do you feel that?" The air was dense, heavy, as if we were being watched by something that did not belong to our world. The presence was so intense that Leo had to step outside to breathe, unable to bear the oppression. That night, the atmosphere already weighed heavily on the old building of the mortuary clinic in Oregon, surrounded by a dense forest and enveloped in almost tangible fog. The silence was so profound that every sound seemed like an omen. I was preparing the body of a child who, according to records, had succumbed to cancer. However, as I unveiled the small body to start the procedure, a shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the sadness of seeing such a young life taken. There was something unusual, disturbing. The child's body was marked with strange, almost ritualistic symbols that did not correspond with the known effects of any disease. They were meticulous engravings on the pale skin, which seemed to have been made post-mortem, designs that evoked a disconcerting archaism, as if they were symbols of an ancient and forgotten culture. The dim light of the laboratory cast shadows that made the symbols seem to sinuously move over the translucent skin. I began my work with a growing sense of discomfort. The silence was now accompanied by a low hum, almost imperceptible, that seemed to emanate from the walls. I focused on the task, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. It was then that Maria, the cleaning staff, entered the laboratory for her usual tasks. The light from the corridor cast a beam through the open door, cutting through the gloom like a beacon. I barely raised my eyes, focused on my delicate work. But suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the night silence, a sound so pure with terror that made me jump. I immediately dropped the instruments and ran towards Maria. I found her collapsed on the floor, her eyes wide open and fixed on something next to the child's body. I followed her gaze and for a moment, thought I saw a shadow fading into the corners of the laboratory, as if something had been there watching and just waiting to be noticed. Maria was unable to speak, her pale face reflecting a mix of horror and disbelief. The night advanced as we tried to calm Maria and understand what she had seen. Music from a distant speaker began to play, a somber and familiar melody that seemed to resonate with the energy of the moment. It was the same music I had heard on the radio that morning, a song about farewells and a world beyond. It seemed like an omen, a link between the death of this child and the unknown. In the weeks that followed, the laboratory was overtaken by an even denser quiet, as if the very air was charged with the secret of that night. Rumors began to spread among the staff about the laboratory being haunted, about the spirits of children who had not found rest. The tension was palpable, an unspoken narrative hovering among us, ingrained in the walls that held stories of past lives and deaths. Reflecting on these events, I continue to question what really happened that night. Between heaven and earth, there are mysteries not just hidden by the unknown, but also by the very shadows of death. The marks on the child's body, the felt presence, the music connecting the dots of an invisible plot. Will we ever understand these enigmas? I leave this story with you, not just as an account of my profession, but as an invitation to look beyond what is seen, to listen beyond what is heard. After all, in our work with the departed, we learn that death may be the end of a life, but it is also a portal to mysteries that go beyond our understanding. Perhaps these mysteries will never be fully revealed, but they certainly leave in the air the sense that there is much more between heaven and earth than we can imagine. Report 2. My name is Juan, and I grew up in a small town in Mexico, where death is not seen merely as an end, but as a vibrant and essential part of life. Here, Dia de los Muertos is celebrated as passionately as any holiday, with colorful altars and festivities that honor those who have passed. My family, known for its peculiarity, has always had a deep connection with the other side. My grandparents talked to the dead as if they were old friends, and this awakened in me a fascination with the mystical and the eternal. Inspired by the environment in which I grew up, I decided to pursue a career that would put me in direct contact with the threshold between life and death. I specialized in mortuary science, the art of caring for the deceased so that they can be presented to their loved ones one last time, and thus in some way, help them in their transition to the beyond. I landed a job at an old and imposing morgue, the only one in the region, known for its numerous dark tales. It was a large, gloomy building, with corridors that echoed an almost palpable silence, interrupted only by the whispers of the wind that seemed to carry voices from the past. Nobody wanted the night shift. Legends of apparitions and unexplained sounds deterred even the bravest. But for me, it was the perfect challenge. On that dark night, as the wind howled around the ancient morgue, I, Juan, was already deep into my nocturnal task. The body of the young woman, shrouded in mysteries and supposedly marked by a failed exorcism, was already prepared. Feeling the need for a brief rest, I headed to the small kitchen to grab a coffee and try to forget the inexplicable whispers and touches that had accompanied me during the work. As the coffee machine gurgled, I could hear the echo of my own footsteps in the silent corridor leading back to the lab. However, as I returned with the steaming cup in hand, a series of inexplicable events began to unfold. First, the lights in the corridor started to flicker erratically, turning off and on with a disconcerting frequency that seemed to follow the rhythm of my racing heartbeat. Suddenly, an intense cold ran down my spine, and in the brief moment when total darkness took over, I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the figure of a woman standing at the end of the corridor. It was an indistinct silhouette, but unmistakably feminine, wrapped in an ethereal aura that could almost be mistaken for the fog forming outside the building at night. I blinked several times, questioning my sanity, but when the lights came back on, the figure had disappeared as if it had never been there. Trying to convince myself that it was just the result of fatigue and stress, I hastened my pace back to the lab. However, before I could get there, a dull thud echoed throughout the building. The doors of the restroom, which I knew I had left closed and secured, were banging violently as if an invisible force was pushing them. My heart raced, and the cup of coffee I held trembled in my hands. With hesitation, I approached the doors, opening them one by one. Inside, nothing but silence and the echo of water droplets from a poorly closed faucet. The heavy breathing and the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It was then that I heard a whisper, almost like a lament, that seemed to come from the depths of the morgue's walls. I couldn't make out words, but the melancholy of the sound was palpable. Returning to the lab to check on the body, an even more disturbing sight awaited me. The drawer where I had left the prepared body was wide open and empty. There were no signs of the woman whom I had so carefully arranged for the last goodbye. A shiver of terror ran through my body. How could a body just disappear like that? I searched every corner, but there was no sign of her. The security cameras in the corridor, which should have recorded all movement, showed only static during the minutes I was away. As a last resort, I decided to check the audio recordings, hoping to capture some sound that might explain what happened. However, what I found was a clear though low voice repeatedly whispering, "Set me free." The days that followed were marked by an investigation that led nowhere. The body was never found, and there were no signs of forced entry or any logical explanation. The experience left a permanent mark, not just on the morgue, but on my soul. I still work there, but not a night has passed without me feeling the presence of the one who disappeared, and the whisper asking for liberation echoes in my dreams. The mystery remains. What really happened that night at the morgue? And who was the woman who seemed to transcend natural barriers to communicate from beyond? These are questions that may never have answers, for between heaven and earth, there are mysteries that our human understanding is not yet ready to unravel. Report 3. My name is John, and my life has been marked by losses and mysteries from an early age. Growing up in a small town on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, known for its haunted stories and an atmosphere permeated by the supernatural. Perhaps it was inevitable that I would end up working with the dead. Maybe I was trying to understand or find closeness to those who, like my younger sister, had departed abruptly and painfully. My sister, Alice, died in a car accident when we were children. I was the older one, and I often felt responsible for looking after her, a responsibility that I carried through the years as a weight on my shoulders. After her death, I plunged into a world of isolation and questioning, and the only answer that seemed to make sense to me lay in death, or rather in what happens after it. Years later, with a degree in mortuary science in hand, I landed a job at the local morgue, an imposing and ancient building that many in town avoided even passing by. Urban legends spoke of apparitions and voices coming from the morgue at night, and no one wanted the night shift, no one except me. My life was already so full of shadows that a few more hardly mattered. It was a damp and cold night in Savannah, and the fog that dragged along the ground seemed almost supernatural. I was alone in the morgue, surrounded only by the silence of the dead and the occasional hum of the devices that maintained the controlled environment. The body of the man who had been delivered earlier that night caused me deep unease. The marks on his skin, although seemingly random, formed patterns that reminded me of ancient symbols, perhaps ritualistic or punitive, which were not unfamiliar to a city with a past so marked by stories of voodoo and black magic. As I prepared to start the autopsy, a sense of discomfort overcame me. The air in the lab seemed heavier, as if laden with the dark energy of an impending storm. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, casting distorted shadows on the walls and ceiling as if the darkness itself was writhing. That's when the sounds began, a loud banging of doors violently along the dark corridor leading to the cold chambers. Armed only with my flashlight, I followed the sound to discover that indeed, all the body compartment doors were open, except for one. My heart raced as I approached the compartment where I had left the man's body. Upon opening the door, I discovered he had disappeared. In his place, only the dark outline of his form remained on the cold metal table. The search for the body was frantic. I scoured every inch of the morgue, but there was no sign of him. The only thing left was a dark stain on the floor, a shadow that seemed etched into the concrete, as if the man had evaporated, leaving behind only the memory of his physical presence. Desperate for answers, I ran to the security room to check the surveillance camera recordings. What I saw on the footage chilled my blood. The body, which should have been lifeless and inert, rose from the table with stiff and awkward movements, walking out of the camera's field of view as if pulled by invisible forces. There was no logical explanation. The man was dead, yet the images showed another reality. In the days that followed, the police were called, and an investigation was opened, but without the body, little could be done. The case remained unsolved, turning into just another urban legend circulating in Savannah. I was left with more questions than answers, questioning the nature of reality and whether indeed what we know as death is just one of many states of existence. Since that day, every shadow in the morgue seems to move with intention, and every whisper carries the weight of unspoken secrets. The marks on the man's body were never explained, and his disappearance continues to haunt me. At night, when I lock the doors of the morgue, I can't help but feel that we are not alone, that there are entities, energies, or spirits that exist on the threshold between life and death, watching, waiting, perhaps even planning. This case reinforced my belief that there is much more between heaven and earth than our vain philosophy can comprehend. And as long as I continue working here, I know I will always be on the verge of discovering something extraordinary, something that perhaps I may not even want to know. Report 4. My name is Kate, and I have always been fascinated by the unknown and the ethereal, a passion intertwined with a reverential respect for death. My choice of career was no coincidence. After tragically losing my mother to drowning when I was just a child, I found in mortuary science not only a way to deal with grief but also a means to connect with those who, like my mother, had abruptly left the world of the living. Living in the small town of Ashwood, United States, I became the local mortician, a profession that allowed me daily interaction with the mysteries of death. On a chilly October night, Kate was in the funeral home's preparation lab, busy suturing a child of just 8 years old who had died from cancer. The lab's usually calm and somber atmosphere that night was charged with an inexplicable energy. After finishing the process, she decided to take a break and stepped outside to smoke, leaving the child's body prepared for the next morning's funeral. In the weeks that followed, even stranger events began to occur in the lab, intensifying the atmosphere of mystery and terror that already enveloped the place. One night, while Kate was working late preparing the body of an elderly man who had died in the community, she heard the sound of music coming from one of the adjacent rooms. It was a soft, sad melody that seemed to float through the air, filling the space with a sense of melancholy and longing. The radio, which was turned off and even unplugged, suddenly began to play this music, as if some invisible presence had decided to bring a bit of consolation or a message through the sound waves. Although frightened, Kate felt a strange calmness invade her being as she recognized the song. It was one of her mother's favorite tunes, often played at their home during her childhood. The coincidence was disturbing, and the mortician couldn't help but feel as if her mother, in some way, was present at that moment, perhaps trying to communicate something through this inexplicable intervention. As the music continued, Kate noticed a small toy, a plastic car, appearing in the middle of the corridor. She was certain the hallway had been empty when she passed through it minutes earlier. The toy, which had belonged to the boy she had prepared that fateful night, now seemed to be a conduit for something inexplicable. It began to move on its own, slowly at first, then more quickly, as if some invisible hand were pushing it down the hallway. The car stopped in front of the lab door where the boy's body had been prepared, pointing as if it wanted Kate to follow something or someone. Determined to face whatever was happening, Kate followed the path indicated by the toy. Upon reaching the lab door, the music abruptly stopped, and a heavy silence fell over the place. Taking a deep breath, she slowly opened the door, and what she saw left her paralyzed with terror and awe. The small figure of the boy, whom she knew to be dead and ready for burial, was standing, looking at her with a serene expression on his face. "Do not be afraid," said the child with a voice that was at once old and young, sad and comforting. "I just wanted to say goodbye in my own way. And thank you for taking care of me." Before Kate could respond, the figure vanished like mist at dawn, leaving only the toy car as proof that it hadn't been a dream. Crying but somehow relieved, Kate realized that her life and profession were bridges between worlds, and that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been chosen to understand and mediate these encounters. In the months that followed, the lab became a place of strange peace for Kate. She continued her work, now with a new perspective on life and death, and with a deeper understanding that sometimes, the veil between this world and the next can be thinner than we imagine. And on particularly quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees outside, Kate sometimes still hears the music, a gentle reminder that love, memory, and the souls that depart can find ways to say what they need to say, even after they have left the physical world. Report 5. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when Joanna received the notification to prepare a body that had just arrived at the funeral home where she worked. The deceased was Jamie the Hunter, a notorious criminal who had spent nearly 2 decades on the run, hiding in a small town in Paraguay before being found and killed by police in a tense confrontation. Jamie had a dark history, accused of multiple murders and known for his ability to vanish before authorities could catch him. Jamie's notoriety filled the tabloids, and his death was awaited by many as a necessary, albeit brutal, closure. Joanna, on the other hand, had a life story marked by resilience and determination. From a young age, she was fascinated by human anatomy and the mysteries of life and death, which led her to the field of mortuary science. Despite the difficulties and the stigma associated with the profession, she dedicated herself to the art of caring for the deceased, seeing it as a way to bring peace and resolution to grieving families and respect to those who had departed. Jamie the Hunter was known in the criminal underworld not only for his skill in evading justice, but also for the merciless brutality of his crimes. Over 2 decades, his figure had become almost legendary, a shadow haunting small villages and large cities with a trail of blood and terror. His specialty was murder for hire, but rumors said that often, his actions went beyond contracts, driven by a personal thirst for violence. It was said he left no survivors, and his victims were often found in scenes that resembled tableaux vivants of death itself, arranged with a macabre precision that spoke of a man who found art in carnage. His methods were varied and terrifying, from silent strangulation to the use of sharp knives that left deep marks not only on the bodies but also on the psyches of the communities he terrorized. In his escape, Jamie hid in a small town in Paraguay, where, under a false identity, he continued his life of crime, but always with the care to keep a low profile to avoid the wrath of local authorities. The night Joanna received Jamie's body for preparation seemed to feed off the deceased's dark history. The lights flickered as if in sync with the heartbeat of a specter still attached to the body. The mist that formed in the lab gave the space an ethereal aspect, almost as if the threshold between life and death had been thinned to near invisibility. As Joanna applied the preservation fluids, a shadow quickly passed by the corner of her eye, disappearing as soon as she turned to look. It was as if Jamie wasn't ready to depart, or as if there was something unresolved that kept him tied to the world of the living. The indecipherable murmurs filling the air were whispers of a violent past, speaking of dark secrets and deeds that not even death could silence. A sharp scream, as sudden as it was terrifying, broke the silence, echoing through the lab walls and causing Joanna's heart to beat with fierce force. Even with fear lurking in every shadow, Joanna remained steadfast. Speaking softly to the body, as was her custom, she sought not only to offer peace to Jamie's spirit, but also to reaffirm her own commitment to the dignity of those who could no longer speak for themselves. "You are at peace now, Jamie. No harm can be done or suffered," she murmured, a prayer for both the deceased and herself. At the end of the procedure, the light stabilized and the temperature normalized. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound but a profound stillness, as if, by covering Jamie with a white sheet, Joanna had also covered the secrets and scars of a life marked by violence. There was a mystery in the air, a secret that Jamie took with him, something that not even death seemed capable of fully revealing. Exhausted but with a sense of duty fulfilled, Joanna left the preparation room, reflecting on the unusual night and the challenges of her work. She knew that despite the inexplicable phenomena, she had granted Jamie something he might never have found in life, a moment of true peace. This was the real victory of her profession, the ability to bring calm and resolution, even to those whose lives were anything but peaceful. As she closed the lab door, Joanna felt the weight of the night gradually dissipating, but the sensation that something extraordinary had occurred there remained, like an invisible mark in the air. Walking down the silent hallway of the funeral home, her thoughts wandered between the untold stories of Jamie the Hunter and the echoes of her own life choices. The journey to becoming a mortician had not been easy. It had been a path filled with prejudices and challenges, where each step deepened her commitment to this forgotten art which, for many, seemed dark and undesirable. She reflected on how, despite moments of terror and strangeness, her profession offered a rare closeness to the eternal cycle of life and death, allowing her to touch not just bodies but transitioning souls. That night, with Jamie, had been different. His presence seemed to have altered the very essence of the space, filling it with shadows and whispers that defied reality. Reaching her office, Joanna sat down, tired but unable to give in to fatigue. She pondered the man Jamie had been, a specter in many lives, a ghost even before his death. The stories of his cruelties were known, but what remained hidden? What secrets did he carry that could have provoked such supernatural manifestations? And what did those secrets say about human nature and mortality itself? As she contemplated these questions, Joanna noticed something peculiar, a small note on Jamie's body delivery report that she hadn't seen before. The words were simple, almost trivial, but in the context of the night, they seemed to carry a deeper meaning. Personal belongings returned to the family, except for one unclaimed item. Curious, Joanna searched for the item, finding in a sealed drawer an old necklace with a symbol she did not recognize. It was a small piece of metal, cold to the touch, but its presence seemed to radiate an untold story, a final enigma of Jamie the Hunter. The necklace, with an intricate design that resembled an amulet or talisman, seemed to be more than just a simple ornament. Could it have been a protection? A curse? Or perhaps a key to understanding the forces that had manifested that night? Joanna felt an inexplicable connection to the object, as if, in some way, It was the missing piece needed to decipher the supernatural events. Making an instinctive decision, Joanna placed the necklace around her neck, feeling a chill run down her spine. At that moment, a strange and deep peace settled over her, as if Jamie's spirit had finally found rest. Or was it a sign that she now carried with her a bit of the shadows he had left behind? In the days that followed, Joanna continued her work with a new perspective, aware of the invisible threads connecting past lives with the present, and perhaps with fate itself. The story of Jamie the Hunter remained partially veiled, an eternal mystery that Joanna now carried with her, symbolized by the necklace that had unexpectedly become part of her life. With each new body she prepared, she wondered about the hidden stories each one carried and about the shadows that, sometimes, just wait to be revealed in the stillness of the night. Report 6. It was a rainy night in Lisbon when I, Lucas, a mortician, faced the most disturbing shift of my career. It all started with the unexpected arrival of a body at the morgue of the clinic where I work. The man, an elderly figure known in the city for his eccentricities and stories of a mysterious past, was found lifeless in his home, located in one of the old winding alleys of Alfama. His death was declared natural, but something about the case didn't sit right with me. I prepared for the standard procedure in an environment where the silence was only broken by the sound of raindrops hitting the window. I began the tracheal aspiration, a technical and normally calm procedure, but that night, it turned into a scene from a horror movie. The night in Lisbon carried a dense darkness, permeated by the constant sound of rain hitting the old windows of the morgue. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and damp, the air saturated with a silence that weighed on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. The only sounds were the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of my own footsteps in the sterilized room, where the smell of chemicals and disinfectants unsuccessfully tried to mask the inevitable odor of death. I approached the body already prepared on the stainless steel table, starkly illuminated by a hanging lamp that cast ghostly shadows over its contours. The man, an elderly individual with stories as murky as the foggy nights of Alfama, lay motionless, his pale skin contrasting with the sheet partially covering him. With trembling hands, I adjusted the cannula to begin the aspiration procedure, a routine practice in mortuary science to preserve the body. As I delicately inserted it into the trachea, a muffled moan broke the silence, weak but unmistakably human. My heart raced, sending a chill through my veins, and an indescribable sense of terror overwhelmed me. It must be my imagination, I thought, trying to calm my erratic breathing. However, when I removed the cannula, the sound repeated, this time clearer and more distinct. There was no doubt, it was a moan, laden with silent agony that resonated in the cold walls of the morgue. Panic took hold of me. The idea that the body might be alive, or that I had made some fatal error, twisted my stomach into a tight knot of fear and guilt. In desperation, I grabbed the phone and, with trembling hands, dialed my supervisor, stumbling over a rushed confession about what I believed had happened. He, confused and concerned for my agitated condition, asked me to calm down and wait while he reviewed the security camera recordings to verify the procedures performed and the exact time of the elderly man's death. As I waited, my gaze was involuntarily drawn back to the body. That's when I noticed, almost hidden under a cloth that had been displaced during the procedure, a small recorder. My heart still pounding, I reached out to grab it, my curiosity mixed with deep apprehension. I pressed the play button, and the next moment, a macabre laugh filled the room, followed by the man's raspy voice, "Even in death, I play pranks." The words, recorded with a tone of sinister amusement, revealed the last trick of a man who, in life, loved to envelop the city in his enigmas and tricks. When I resumed the call to tell my supervisor about the discovery, he confirmed, relieved and still incredulous, that it had all been a posthumous joke by the eccentric old man. The man was indeed dead, as the cameras clearly showed. Although the shift had ended and the mystery was clarified, the sensation of that night stayed with me for a long time. The streets of Lisbon continued to sleep, unaware of the theater of horrors that had unfolded beneath their surface. I, on the other hand, would never forget the old man and his last words, recorded with a laugh that seemed to echo in the shadows of the city, reminding me that sometimes, the dead have more stories to tell than the living could ever imagine. Report 7. My life has always been intertwined with the mysteries of death, a family legacy that dates back generations. In Argentina, where traditions are preserved with almost sacred respect, I, Samira, became the third generation of morticians in my family, following in the footsteps of my mother, who taught me everything I know about caring for those who have departed. I grew up listening to stories of restless souls, of spirits whispering secrets from beyond during the silent nights in the corridors of our family funeral home. My mother, with her hands always so steady and calm, never hesitated in her mission, and it was under her tutelage that I learned not only the techniques of preservation but also the dignity we owe to the dead. On a particularly cold night in June, I was alone in the funeral home. A storm had isolated the city, and the wind howled like a choir of lost voices. That's when I received the call. A body needed immediate care, an urgent and mysterious situation. Such a rushed procedure was uncommon, but in our profession, we learned to expect the unexpected. Elisa, the young woman whose body lay before me in the funeral home, had been found dead under circumstances that no one could explain. The local police found no signs of violence or clear evidence indicating the cause of her sudden death. The mystery surrounding Elisa deepened when I discovered a small folded paper hidden under her tongue, an object that seemed to carry more than mere words. The symbols drawn and the names written on the paper suggested practices of black magic. One of the names was mine, and the other my deceased mother, known in our community for her ability to handle complicated spiritual cases. My heart sank as I recognized the symbols that my mother had often warned me were used in rituals of cursing and spiritual manipulation. Elisa, apparently, had been involved in something very dark and dangerous. I decided to keep the paper with me, a decision that immediately transformed the atmosphere around me. That same night, while the paper rested in a locked drawer in my room, strange phenomena began to occur. Unintelligible whispers echoed through the corridors of the house, as if distant voices were trying to communicate an urgent and desperate message. Fleeting shadows appeared out of the corners of my eyes, disappearing when I tried to focus on them. In the days that followed, inexplicable marks began to appear on my arms. They were like small scratches, forming patterns that resembled the symbols on the paper. Sleeping became a difficult task. My dreams were invaded by visions of Elisa, whose eyes pleaded for help and liberation. She appeared in distorted settings, surrounded by shadowy figures murmuring enchantments in an ancient and forgotten language. Aware of my family's legacy and my mother's warnings about black magic, I began to investigate more deeply. I discovered that our family, for generations, had been the target of curses by those who distrusted or envied our closeness to the spiritual. My mother, in particular, had broken many magical ties and therefore had accumulated both respect and resentment in our community. Determined to solve this puzzle and free both myself and Elisa from these spiritual bonds, I sought help from a specialist in occultism and white magic. Together, we performed a purification ritual, using the paper as a connection point to break any spells linked to it. During the ritual, the environment was overtaken by a sudden storm, and the paper inexplicably began to burn until it turned to ashes, even without any visible source of fire. After the ritual, the paranormal phenomena ceased, and a sense of peace returned to my life. However, the mystery of how Elisa became involved with such forces remained unanswered. The only clue was a diary found among her personal belongings, handed to me by an investigator who knew of my involvement. The diary contained references to encounters with a group that explored occult practices, and Elisa seemed increasingly fearful and desperate to escape them. The last entry in the diary was a plea for help, dated just a few days before her death. She wrote that she felt her energy being drained and feared that her soul was in danger. Elisa knew something deep and dangerous, something that perhaps cost her life. As I closed the diary, I realized that the battle against the shadows does not end with rituals and breaking curses. It continues in the memory of those who depart and in the vigilance of those who remain. My work in the funeral home now carries a new meaning, not just to preserve the dead, but also to protect the living from the shadows that might come from beyond. Report 8. Years ago, my mother, Lucia, passed away, and I had to attend her funeral with my children and my husband, Andres. We hadn't been in contact for a long time, mainly because we did not get along. Lucia had a very strong temper. She was harsh with my brother, Santiago, and me. She never physically harmed us, but her words were strict and offensive. I do not recall a single time when she showed affection. The main reason I decided to distance myself was her involvement with strange people linked to cults that performed rituals. This made living together even more tense. She became cold and distant, and strange things started to happen in the house, like nocturnal noises and shadows moving around. I decided to move away with my husband, and since then I had no more contact with her, to protect my children from the negative energy. When Lucia died, my sister Catalina called to deliver the devastating news. On a wintry day in February, the heavy sky and a gloomy fog filled the air as we headed to the funeral home, where the atmosphere was even more gloomy and cold. Upon arrival, we were greeted with the news that Lucia had been dead for 2 days, found lifelessly on the sofa by a friend, victim of a sudden heart attack. As I filled out the necessary forms, enveloped in the oppressive silence of the funeral home, a familiar voice broke the quietude. It was Lucia's voice, clear and unmistakable, softly calling my name. I froze in place, my heart beating erratically. I heard it again, more insistent this time. Driven by an impulse I couldn't explain, I followed the voice that guided me through a dark corridor to a room at the back, reserved and forbidden to the public. Pushing the door open, I found her there, Lucia, lying on the stretcher, naked and with her eyes disturbingly open. When the stretcher creaked under the weight of her rising, my terror escalated to unimaginable heights. She stared at me intently, her penetrating eyes full of a dark secret. I ran back to the reception, terrified. The next day, during the wake, the surreal became palpable again. My little Daniela, innocently leaning on the coffin, was talking and laughing as if she were interacting with her grandmother. "We're chatting," she said, cheerful and carefree. It was then that I realized. Lucia's spirit still permeated the place, her presence a cold whisper in the shadows. The calamity unfolded later when Lucia's body disappeared from the coffin, only to be found hours later, inexplicably charred as if consumed by a fierce and invisible fire. The impossible unfolded before our eyes, revealing that something more sinister, more ancient, and more vengeful had manifested. The situation escalated the next day, in the silence of the wake, when Daniela, clinging to the coffin, insisted that Lucia wanted to take her away. My attempt to separate them was met with supernatural resistance, Daniela screaming that Lucia refused to let her go. In a desperate act, I fled with her in my arms, promising never to return to that cursed place. That night, the image of Lucia, both alive and dead, haunted me. I kept the incident a secret, protecting Andres and the little ones from a truth that could shatter any semblance of peace. Lucia's shadow, now more a disturbing memory than a loved one, seemed to stretch beyond death, infiltrating the cracks of our reality, whispering promises of despair. What started as a farewell became an encounter with the inexplicable, a dark journey through a veil that separates the lived from the ethereal. The funeral home, with its cold walls and distant echoes, became a portal to something deeply terrifying, leaving a legacy of fear and mystery that resonates to this day, a macabre narrative intertwined in the fabric of my existence, forever in the shadow of Lucia. Report 9. My name is Salvatore Bellini, and for over 20 years, I have dedicated myself to the quiet and solitary work of preparing corpses for their final moments of rest before being handed over to families. My role as a mortician is to ensure that the bodies are in presentable condition so that mourners can have a last dignified memory of their departed loved ones. Working with the dead is not easy, but over time, you learn to ignore the weight that this work carries. Or, at least, that's what I always believed, until that night. It was a winter night in Naples. The humidity and cold cut through the air, and the wind blew through the narrow stone streets, producing sounds that mingled with the distant howling of the sea. The funeral home where I worked, a century-old building, stood in the oldest part of the city. The dark and lengthy corridors, with their flickering lights, always seemed more sinister when the rain incessantly drummed on the roof. That night, we received a new body. It was a man named Vittorio Il Fantasma Ragusa, a famous motorcyclist known both for his skill on the tracks and the brutality of his end. Vittorio had died in a horrific accident. He was run over by a truck on a winding road in the hills, leaving his body unrecognizable. When they brought him to the funeral home, the state of the corpse was something I had rarely seen in my years of experience. The motorcyclist was terribly deformed by the impact, his face disfigured, and his limbs, once strong and agile, broken and twisted at impossible angles. It was clear that this would be a long night, where I would have to do everything possible to restore a minimum semblance of dignity to Vittorio for his wake. As usual, I began my work alone. The room was cold, and the sound of my footsteps echoed off the worn tile walls. The old fluorescent lamps flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows in the corners of the room. I put on my gloves and began the reconstruction process. But, as I worked, something disturbing began to happen. First, I felt a presence in the room. It was not uncommon to feel watched during the preparation of a body, but this time it was different. The air felt heavier, as if something invisible were surrounding me. I ignored the feeling, convinced it was just the fatigue accumulated from long hours of work. I continued to sew the deep cuts on Vittorio's chest, focused on the technique, but a slight sense of discomfort would not leave me. Then I heard a noise. A soft tick-tick, like quick, light footsteps upstairs, where we kept the bodies before preparing them. I froze. I knew it was impossible for anyone to be up there. The building was empty, except for me and the body. I was about to leave the room to investigate when the footsteps intensified. It was as if someone was walking frantically back and forth, each second more agitated. I decided I needed to check what was happening. I slowly climbed the wooden stairs, which creaked under my weight, and the lights on the upper floor were off. The darkness enveloped the environment oppressively, and it took my eyes a while to adjust. I should have been alone, but the charged silence said otherwise. I turned on the light, and there in the center of the room was something that shouldn't have been there, a small teddy bear, an apparently insignificant toy, but completely out of place in that cold and impersonal environment. My heart raced. I knew that bear hadn't been there before. I approached the bear slowly, as if it might explode at any moment. I approached cautiously, and when I picked it up in my hands, something happened that I will never forget. I heard a whisper, soft and distant, as if coming from all directions at once. "Give it to her." My hands trembled, and I dropped the bear on the floor, stepping back. "Give it to her," the voice repeated, louder and closer this time. Fear took over me. This was not my imagination. The bear, now lying on the floor, seemed to radiate a strange energy. I returned to the preparation room as quickly as I could. I tried to resume my work, but I was too disturbed. Vittorio's disfigured face seemed to stare at me with an empty, but judging look. The whispers continued echoing in my mind. Who was she? And why was this bear so important? That night, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The lights flickered continuously, and the sound of the wind seemed to be accompanied by distant murmurs. I decided to finish the procedure as quickly as possible. I knew something supernatural was happening, something I couldn't explain. I finished embalming Vittorio and placed him in one of the refrigeration chambers, trying to shake off the feeling that something or someone was watching me closely. Just as I was about to leave the room, I heard the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were coming from the stairs. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I knew I needed to face whatever was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back upstairs. When I arrived, the teddy bear was back in the center of the room, exactly where I had found it before. But this time, it wasn't alone. The figure of a woman, enveloped in a faint mist, stood beside it. Her sad eyes fixed on mine, and her voice whispered softly, "Give it to her, my daughter." At that moment, everything made sense. The teddy bear belonged to Vittorio's daughter. He had bought the toy for her just before his death, but in the chaos of the accident, the bear was lost. The presence I felt was Vittorio's, still tied to this world, trying to ensure that the last gift he had bought for his daughter reached the right hands. With tears in my eyes, I carefully held the bear. "I will deliver it," I promised out loud, feeling the presence of the woman begin to fade. The air around me seemed to lighten, as if a burden had been lifted. The next day, I looked for Vittorio's family. His wife, a strong but weary-looking woman, welcomed me into their home. When I gave the teddy bear to Vittorio's little daughter, who did not understand the weight of the moment, I felt a peace flood the room. The girl, without saying a word, hugged the bear tightly and smiled. Her eyes sparkled with the innocence of someone who had not known the horror of loss. Vittorio's wife thanked me, unaware of the mystery surrounding that toy. But I knew. And I knew that, finally, Vittorio's spirit had found rest. He had completed his last mission in this world. I returned to the funeral home that night, feeling that something had changed within me. The shadows that used to crawl through the corners of the room seemed less threatening, and the silence of the preparation room was, for the first time, comforting. The wind howled outside, but this time, it was just the wind. The story of Vittorio il Fantasma Ragusa would continue to circulate through the streets of Naples, but I knew the truth. The man many feared and hated had, in his final moments, merely wished to do something good for his daughter. And through the veil between life and death, he had found a way to ensure that his last act of love was not forgotten. Since then, the teddy bear has become a symbol for me, a reminder that even in the darkness of death, love and remorse can cross barriers we do not know. Working with the dead has taught me a lot about life, but it was the story of Vittorio and his bear that showed me that sometimes, the dead still have something to say, and it is up to us to listen. And occasionally, when the wind blows strong on winter nights, I can almost hear a distant whisper, as if it were a thank you from beyond, grazie. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like to support us. And more importantly, if you have any supernatural experiences, don't keep them to yourself. Write your story in the comments below. Share your encounter with the inexplicable, feed the collective curiosity, and who knows, maybe together we can unravel these mysteries that hover like mist between the world of the living and the dead. Remember, the unknown is always lurking, just a report away. And now, with the night falling, who knows what shadows might emerge from the darkness to whisper one more true story of terror.